Look closely at the brain, and you see billions of isolated neurons firing in discrete sparks. Yet our daily experience feels like a seamless, unbroken flow of perception, emotion, and memory. How do fragmented parts generate a unified, continuous whole? For decades, neuroscientists have relied on the metaphor of the binary spark, the idea that neurons act like simple on or off computer switches. This binary model struggles to explain the rich integration of our mental lives. A localized electrical spark fails to account for how a specific smell triggers a complex childhood memory paired with a heavy emotional weight. To bridge this gap, we can look to the Brain Kinematics Model, or BKM, combined with continuity theory. BKM treats neural activity as a dynamic strain flow, a continuous field of physical tension and energy moving across the structural architecture of the brain. BKM defines the mind as a dynamically constructed proxy model, an active simulation built by shifting networks of neural strain. To see how this simulation is built, we have to track the emergence of experience from the bottom up. We will follow the physical flow of data, from nanoscale biological fluctuations to the formation of localized patterns, to the coupling of those patterns, and finally to the macroscopic continuum we recognize as awareness. Understanding consciousness requires moving beyond the idea of the brain as a rigid binary computer. Instead, we must look very closely at the actual microscopic physical spaces where living neurons connect and communicate. Let's start at the smallest relevant scale, the synaptic cleft. This is the microscopic gap between two communicating neurons. This image shows an electron micrograph of that exact biological space. Notice the physical gap between the neural structures and the distinct clusters of vesicles. It is a highly complex, variable chemical and topological environment, far removed from a simple, hardwired connection. Information transmission across this gap relies on a precise alignment of multiple variables: the physical width of the cleft, the density of receptor proteins, the timing of neurotransmitter release, and the state of surrounding local electric fields. When these variables align perfectly, BKM defines the synapse as being in a coupled state. This creates a solid biological bridge, allowing the effective flow of neural strain from one cell to the next. If the geometry or timing is slightly off, the synapse enters a weakly coupled state, where the flow of data fragments, delays, or leaks. Should conditions deteriorate further, the connection becomes decoupled, and that specific local pathway drops out of the active network entirely. This introduces a critical BKM concept, the effective coupling window. This represents the exact spectrum of physical conditions required for a signal, the strain flow, to survive and propagate across the network. Neural communication operates as a dynamic tuning valve. It actively shapes and directs the flow of physical strain through the brain based on the immediate, shifting geometry of millions of microscopic gaps. When we zoom out from a single synapse to a cluster of thousands of neurons, we enter the mesoscopic scale. At this intermediate level, the rules of complex systems physics begin to dominate the brain's behavior. Physicist Roberto Serra demonstrated that in complex systems, microscopic fluctuations, like a slight variation in synaptic timing or a brief sensory pulse, are structurally important. Because the neural network is highly interconnected, these tiny local variations are non-linearly amplified to generate large-scale structural order. Through this amplification, chaotic activity naturally self-organizes into what physicists call attractors. In the brain, an attractor is a temporarily stabilized configuration of strain flow, a specific pathway that the network naturally prefers to take. This physical self-organization directly maps onto the cognitive theories developed by Edward de Bono. De Bono proposed that the mind operates primarily as a self-organizing pattern-making system, where thoughts are guided by established routes. Once a neural attractor forms, it acts like a physical groove in the network. New sensory input is preferentially captured and routed down these well-worn pathways. Over time, these stabilized flows embody our memories, our fixed beliefs, and our mental habits. What we experience as a cognitive bias or a rigid habit is the physical result of mesoscopic strain flows settling into the path of least resistance. If the brain naturally locks into these deeply rutted patterns, How does it ever generate a new idea, adapt to a changing environment, or change its mind? This phase-space graph maps the life cycle of a cognitive pattern. The vertical axis represents the stability of the neural strain, while the horizontal axis tracks its dispersion, or variability. We begin in the continuum phase. Here, we see high dispersion and moderate stability. Data flows in multiple directions as a diffuse cloud. This represents a state of exploration, or how the brain processes raw perception before a specific pattern takes over. As the network settles, it drops into the pattern locking phase. Dispersion decreases and stability spikes. The diffuse flow collapses into a deep, singular attractor well. This is the physical signature of a rigid habit, a repetitive thought, or an entrenched belief. The system remains trapped here until it experiences a lateral shift. This shift occurs when the accumulated physical strain, often driven by contradictory sensory input or emotional overload, exceeds the well's stability capacity. The network is pushed to an instability boundary, or a bifurcation edge, where the old pattern begins to break apart. Finally, the system crosses into the new continuum. The network re-expands, dispersion increases, and the flow rebalances to form entirely new attractors. In human experience, this physical reorganization is what we feel as a sudden insight, a total structural reorganization of data, or an act of lateral thinking. Creative breakthroughs emerge as forced physical phase transitions, occurring precisely when an old neural pattern fails to contain the accumulated strain of reality. Zooming out from a single thought to the entire cortex, we are no longer looking at one pattern forming and breaking. We are observing thousands of these localized phase transitions occurring simultaneously across billions of synaptic connections. This massive, coordinated activity generates the neural continuum. The continuum is the emergent, field-like behavior produced by thousands of densely interacting mesoscopic patterns seamlessly handing off data to one another. For this global continuum to function, the cortex must operate in a state of metastability. This is a dynamic regime where systems exist between order and disorder, stable enough to hold a form, but flexible enough to dissolve and rebuild it instantly. The brain must carefully manage its integration-segregation balance. If the network becomes too integrated, the system suffers a rigid lock-in, resulting in obsessions. If the network becomes too segregated, the continuum shatters into fragmentation, leading to confusion or unconsciousness. A functional mind exists on the knife edge between order and chaos, constantly dissolving and reforming its global architecture to match the present moment. How do we categorize the architecture of this global continuum in the language of human psychology and self-awareness? We can translate classical philosophy directly into the physics of the BKM framework. This topological map represents the philosophy of mind. In physical terms, it is the structural form of the system, the static, generalized geometry of the brain's internal attractors and memory pathways. Operating on top of that structure is the theory of mind, which represents dynamic motion over the form. This is the brain simulating other agents, predicting the intentions and emotions of other people by running nested strain flow models within its own terrain. This entire structural and dynamic system is enclosed within a continuous feedback loop, from external reality through our sensory interface, processed by the mind, resulting in an action, which then alters external reality once again. The mind functions as a continuously updated proxy model. It reconstructs reality by integrating sensory input and memory structures into a functional internal representation. And consciousness is the metastable, coherent regime operating within this neural continuum. It is the active, dynamic alignment between our internal proxy model and the external physical world. We physically construct the continuum through these microscopic coupling windows. Consciousness arises as an emergent, meaning-bearing field phenomenon within that structured interaction.